Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this academic ceremony in which Dr. Thomas Conselman will officially accept his chair in international relations. He will do so by presenting his inaugural lecture entitled Who Governs, Authority and Authorization in Global Affairs. A special welcome to Professor Kohler, who holds an honorary doctorate in our university. Welcome. My name is Rein de Wilde. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, the faculty in which Thomas is appointed. Much to his regret, the rector was unable to chair the meeting due to other obligations. So therefore, this afternoon I will act as your pro-rector. Thomas obtained his master's degree in political science at the University of Heidelberg and completed his PhD at the University of Mannheim, both with the highest distinctions. He held positions in the Mannheim Center of European Social Research and at the University of Darmstadt, and also colleagues over here now of Darmstadt, out of Darmstadt, isn't it? Welcome. That was until 2007, so in 2007 Thomas came to Maastricht, and from 2009 to 2013 he served as Associate Dean for Research in our faculty, directing our research institute and also our graduate school. Highly appreciated by the faculty, but quite a demanding task. In 2012, because he still had time for doing research, luckily, he won a prestigious so-called FIDI grant for a large research project called No Carrots, No Sticks: How do peer reviews among states acquire authority in global governance? Well, given the title of your inaugural lecture, I guess we will hear more about that in a minute. Dear Dr. Conselman, the floor is yours. So, welcome, everyone.
Dear Rector Magnificus, dear Rein, dear colleagues, dear family and friends from nearby and afar, dear students. I feel honored and privileged to see so many of you here in this former church of the Minderbruders. To celebrate my inauguration as a professor of international relations at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences of our university. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate your interest in my talk. The core in which I'm standing here dates from the late 17th century, and in its long history has heard both the elevating chorals of Franciscan monks as well as the vicars of horses when this was a horse barn of the Royal Military Constabulary of the Netherlands. So my own talk today will fall somewhere in between these two extremes of chorals and vicars. So let's see how it goes. Who governs? This question has preoccupied both current-day political scientists and ancient philosophers. The essential issue that this question brings up is who actually has the power to influence political decisions. Such decisions may be the ones that are legally binding, as for instance laws issued by governments binding citizens within their respective national borders. But we may also talk about decisions by non-state actors that have a factual impact on global affairs. I will argue today that the question of who governs in global affairs needs a fresh look, and that the concept of authority and authorization can be helpful in this respect. Okay. Why is that? Okay, good. Think about a private organization called Transparency International, which is best known for publishing an annual corruption perception index. One of the slides here, or one of the pictures above me here is taken from this report. Simply put, this is a publicly available ranking which helps citizens but also business firms to determine which countries are the most or the least corrupt. This ranking will influence the standing of that country with international investors and foreign donors and lead to a higher likelihood that foreign direct investment or also official development aid is going to that country. Think about another example. A decision of Standard & Poor's two international rating agencies to lower the credit rating of a country such as Italy or Greece, which you see rather far down in this league table here. This makes lending for the national governments of these countries more expensive. It will, with some likelihood, lead national governments to try to regain a more favorable rating through, for instance, cutting down on social security provisions or through the reduction of public services. Or, let us take an example from the field of international organizations. We have all become accustomed to the idea that the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, should rate the quality of our schooling systems. What you see here again is a ranking taken from the latest Pisa inquiry of the OECD. Again, the impact of this assessment on domestic policy making can be quite profound. In Germany, national policymakers have even been experiencing a so-called Pisa shock after the OECD, in its 2001 assessment, found the German educational system to be wanting in certain respects. As a consequence, policymakers started a debate on how pupils from less educated households could be better integrated into schooling systems. And there was also a debate on whether the kindergarten should not become a kind of preschool. Meanwhile, representatives from the Flemish community in Belgium made a point about their much better PISA results than those of the Walloon community in Belgium. But none of these actors, neither in Belgium nor in Germany, seem to be in doubt that the OECD should make the assessments in the way they did. Now, what do these three examples have in common? First, states have come under the scrutiny by external actors. States are subjected to a recurrent quality check of their policies, much as cars are subjected to a road safety check from time to time. The Germans among you may enjoy the metaphor of a Staaten-TÜV that some German scholars have used for this. Second, all the actors mentioned before are what political scientists and international relations scholars usually call non-state actors. Business firms such as Standard & Poor's, civil society organizations such as Transparency International, and the bureaucracies of international organizations such as the OECD are distinct from states. They have no legal powers and cannot enforce their decisions in the same way that a state could. Nonetheless, they play a role in global affairs and, under certain circumstances, can become important for national policy development. A third commonality is that none of the activities I have mentioned so far are based, at least not fully, on a political mandate given by states. One could argue that external scrutiny by non-state actors and the impact that this has on domestic policies are actually not problematic, as long as nation-states remain in control. But this is in fact not true. Neither Standard & Poor's nor Transparency International have been mandated by states to provide the services that they provide. And a similar argument can actually be made about the OECD. Once states charged it with the assessment of schooling systems, the way in which the assessment is done was taken out of the hands of the member states to some degree. National vetoes against assessments are not possible any longer, and much of the practical execution of PISA is actually done by the OECD bureaucracy. So, is the notion of national sovereignty dead? Certainly not. But what we can say is that important structures of non-state authority have emerged alongside the states. Non-state actors are providing a normative standard for the assessment of the performance of state. They are listened to by policymakers, by business people, and by the broader public. Under certain circumstances, their assessments are consequential and it may be difficult for states to just ignore them. Such authority is a form of power in global affairs. It makes actors influential even though they do not issue binding laws or regulations. There are also many other examples where scholars have argued that authority exists in global affairs outside of the states. So let me just briefly mention three more to just show this is broader than these assessments of states that I've shown you in the beginning. First, private regulatory organizations that seek to promote corporate social responsibility. That is the observance of human rights, labor rights, and environmental and safety standards in transnational business operations. You may have heard about this example here, the so-called Forest Stewardship Council, abbreviated FSC, which provides a logo through which consumers can identify wood products that have been produced in line with social and environmental standards set by the organization. Interestingly, the FSC has been widely seen as an authoritative voice on how to best protect the world's forests. Second, the authority of individuals of an unquestionable moral standing. Think about Nelson Mandela, Kofi Annan, who we see here, or also Jimmy Carter, former American president. All of them in various ways can credibly claim to speak for certain values and ideals of mankind and to be independent of any national government or other vested interest. Such individuals are often said to carry moral authority. They can, for instance, bring warring parties together or alert the world community to certain problems, such as Jimmy Carter is doing in the example shown here, where he talks about the fate of women and girls in violent conflicts. A third example are international bureaucracies and their leaders that have been described as authorities by some scholars. The argument is that these bureaucracies can carry moral and expert authority, but also authority derived from the rational and disinterested execution of their competences. Okay, so just to sum up, we have a lot of authority, or a lot of talk at least, about authority in global affairs. Now let's see what we can make with that. The discussion, in my view, should not stop there by simply enumerating a number of authorities in global affairs. There are, in my view, two problems with the examples and also with that I have shown you, but also with the discussion as it is going at the moment. First, the concept of authority is applied to so many different actors and institutions that its precise meaning becomes rather unclear. Authority is sometimes understood as a characteristic of an actor, sometimes as a quality of a rule. In other instances, the term of authority is used in a more metaphorical sense. So, what do we actually mean when we say that an actor or an organization carries authority? My key argument is that authority should be seen as a relational concept. That means that authority is not simply derived from the possession of expertise or regulatory powers or any other quality of an actor, but crucially depends on the recognition of this authority by others. Authority, to slightly modify a well-known saying, lies in the eye of the beholder. That's one of the key messages here. Second question, how can we empirically measure authority? How do we determine whether an international organization or some form of private regulation carries more or less authority than others? To discuss this, I will briefly present the approach and some results of a research project on peer reviewing procedures among states that my team and I are currently involved in. That is the project that Rein has mentioned in the beginning, the so-called VD grant. Now, and starting from these discussions, I will propose a research program that puts the recognition of authority central. I want to show how this research can be applied to different kinds of actors and different types of authority. I also want to show how the approach suggested here links to existing research programs within our faculty and our university. Okay, let me start with the first point of how to define authority. The problem here is that soon as private regulatory organizations emerged or non-state actors contributed to agenda setting, scholars began to talk about the existence of authority in global affairs. The focus was on what one scholar called, I quote, the changing nature of authority in the international system. And this was little more than a metaphor for the empirical observation that, again, I quote, the world is seeing changes in who is providing collective goods. Of course, this is not entirely wrong, but I think that we can do better than this. First, and most importantly, authority doesn't simply exist because some governance functions are taken over by specific actors or because these actors possess specific resources, as I have said before. An additional element is the recognition of this power as legitimate by third actors. The fact that Transparency International is providing the ranking that we are seeing here of how corrupt different states are is not the decisive point. The decisive point, I think, is that this ranking is being used by a great many public actors, and that the method it uses and the results it produces are accepted unquestioningly. The fact that the Forest Stewardship Council comes up with a label to identify products from sustainable forestry is maybe not that interesting. After all, there are dozens of these labels that exist. The interesting fact is that this label has for a long time been seen as a kind of gold standard in sustainable forestry. Only recently a competitor scheme has emerged that can command similar recognition, the so-called Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification. So, how can we explain such processes of recognition and power of a civil society organization such as Transparency International or of a private regulatory organization such as the Forest Stewardship Council? This is where a distinct concept of authority comes in. In the words of Cutler, Haufler, and Porter, one of the authors I'm also quoting in the paper that this lecture is based on, in their definition, authority exists when an individual or organization has decision-making power over a particular issue area and is regarded as exercising that power legitimately. So also the idea of legitimacy is coming into this concept of authority here. In the words of Raghi, another great man of our discipline, authority should be understood as a fusion of power with legitimate social purpose. In this concept, authority is the product of a relationship between, on the one hand, the bearer of authority, and on the other hand, the actors or groups that recognize this authority. I will call this latter group the audience in my talk. In such a concept, authority emerges where actors begin to voluntarily follow or at least take into account the rules, advice, or viewpoints that another actor or organization provides because of their perception that the rules, advice, or viewpoints carry legitimacy. Now, I'm aware that I'm treating you with a rather abstract discussion here. Sorry for that, but I think it's also important to be clear on concepts before we go on. So, who cares? Why should this be interesting, what I've presented so far? I want to make 3 arguments in order to, in a way, defend and justify all this theorizing that maybe is a little bit hard to bear on a Friday afternoon. First point. I think that this concept offers interesting perspectives for the comparison between different organizations, actors, or institutions. In the research project on peer reviews that I'm presenting later on, we ask why some peer reviewing procedures among states are taken more seriously than others. That is, why they are carrying more authority. We are looking for the answer by understanding the authority perceptions of the audience at whom the results of a peer review are directed. So, for instance, domestic policymakers, the media, but also the broader civil society. Second point, I believe that this approach offers better opportunities for a dynamic perspective. By this I mean the question of how authority is gained or lost and how some actors are trying to establish themselves as authorities. Again, the answer would lie in authority perceptions, in my view. It is quite obvious that, for instance, international organizations are employing specific strategies to establish themselves as authorities, for instance, by hiring experts or by opening up to civil society. But the interesting question, of course, is whether and to what extent they are successful in this. Here we have to understand what the audience thinks about these international organizations and their activities, and whether they perceive them as authoritative. Third, it seems to me that this approach is particularly pertinent in a world in which there is no real agreement on the normative standards to be applied in global governance. There is no normative consensus about a good political order, and therefore the discussion of different standards of legitimacy that are applied in global affairs is a key necessity, in my view. In this sense, research into the recognition of authority by specific groups of actors constitute an interesting and highly relevant focus. Dear colleagues, dear friends, in the first part of my lecture, I have provided some basic thoughts. In the next steps, now let me spell out how to make practical the research program I'm proposing here. I'm doing this by discussing the research project on peer reviews among states that has been mentioned before, and that my team, Hortense Jongen, Martina Kühner, and Valentina Carraro are currently involved in. So take a moment to look at that. This slide gives a practical idea of what peer reviews among states actually imply. You see recommendations that the Netherlands received from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in the latest rounds of reviews of its economic policies in April 2014. They focus on the three priority areas of fiscal consolidation, banking regulation, and helping small and medium-sized enterprises through public loans and deregulating the labor market. This system of country surveillance, as the OECD calls it, is a long-standing activity of the organization, and according to some researchers is held in quite high esteem by policymakers in the member states. It is important to note that these recommendations are not made by the OECD Secretariat alone, but also by the member states. These member states come together in a body called the Economic and Development Review Committee, quite a long title, in which the member states are conducting this review among peers. So states are giving recommendations to other states on what they should do in order to have a thriving banking sector or to bring down the household debt, for instance. In the end of the review process, they come up with the recommendations that we're seeing here on the slide. Importantly, the recommendations are not binding, they are just recommendations. In order to have an impact on the ground, the peer review procedure and its outcomes need to be recognized as meaningful by the states. In other words, the question is whether review and recommendations carry authority. Are they being listened to, or do they simply disappear in the spam folders of Whitehall bureaucrats? As a British newspaper, I think it was not even a tabloid newspaper, remarked earlier this month when the European Commission was giving its advice on economic policies to the member states. So the next slide relates to precisely this. Sorry, it's in German, but it's taken from a German newspaper and I couldn't find an English one that featured the same story. It shows a headline from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, published only 2 days ago. It reads, "States flout Brussels recommendations." The European semester that the article relates to is part of the strengthened coordination of macroeconomic policies in the European Union that was installed as a reaction to the ongoing financial crisis. The system works in such a way that the Commission, together with the Council of Ministers, makes certain recommendations that are directed at individual member states. Again, a system of peer review is installed in this way. The article reports findings from a study commissioned by the European Parliament, according to which many of these recommendations are ignored or are only implemented half-heartedly. So in this case, there seem to be signs of a lack of authority, at least in comparison to what we have seen in the case of the OECD before. And an interesting question then, of course, becomes, why is that? And is it actually true that the OECD is carrying more authority than the European Union does in its review of economic policies? Starting from such impressions, as well as the vast number of peer-reviewing schemes that in the meantime exist in global affairs, they exist in the WTO, in the International Monetary Fund, in the African Union, in the OECD, of course, in the European Union, in many, many other international organizations. So starting from such newspaper stories, as well as from the magnitude of numbers of peer reviews that exist, we ask 2 questions in our project. First is it actually true that various peer reviews show different degrees of authority? What are the perceptions and beliefs directed at peer reviews? And how are reviews conducted in practice? Second, to the extent that we can identify differences, we want to know how to explain such differences. If it is, for instance, true that the OECD reviews carry more authority than those organized within the European Union, how can we explain that? In other words, we want to focus on the conditions under which peer reviews among states are acquiring authority in their field. Our key hypothesis, as you see here on the slide, is that organizational and policy contexts shape peer review procedures and may or may not facilitate the emergence of authority. How does that look in practice? We conduct a comparative study of peer reviews among states in 4 different policy fields that you can see here on the left-hand side: human rights, the fight against corruption, environmental policies, and economic policies. We are also looking at 3 different organizational contexts: the OECD, the United Nations family, and the European Union/Council of Europe. So what you could in general call regional integration institutions or organizations in Europe. The principal idea is that these different organizational and policy contexts may have a systematic impact on the emergence of authority perceptions and the functioning of peer reviews. More about this in the paper. I unfortunately have no time to really go into that now. Now, in this slide that I'm showing you here, you can see some examples of the questions that we are asking to interviewees. This is actually based on another definition of authority by scholars Cronin and Hurd, where they argue that authority depends on the legitimacy perceptions directed at the mission of an international organization, at its procedures, and at its capabilities. So we ask, for instance, do people think that it is appropriate to conduct a peer review in a specific area? Is the peer review conducted properly, or does it produce meaningful results? And interestingly, you can see that you get quite different answers to these questions in different peer reviewing schemes. A first finding that we have is that peer review in general receives quite widespread support. Regardless of whether interviewees at the OECD, the Council of Europe, or other international organizations are asked, they see some merit in peer reviewing. However, there are quite some differences in whether reviews are valued simply because the lack of alternative monitoring instruments, or because reviews are seen as possessing some intrinsic value. A second finding is that it is not just the perception of the functions and the purpose of the reviews that differ, but also the standards by which reviews are evaluated. For instance, when asking whether respondents think that a review is conducted in a fair manner, we see that the applied fairness standards are quite distinct across organizations. In the OECD, for instance, the idea that all participants should be submitted to the same standard of review is predominant. In the Council of Europe, however, the idea of differentiated reviewing is much more common, meaning that reviews are conducted according to the level of development and other country-specific characteristics. Thus, it seems that what is considered appropriate or fair in one organization would not be seen as fair in another. One issue we are wrestling with is who precisely carries authority. So if we say that a peer review is authoritative, this may be a statement about the perceptions of the review procedure as such, but it may also be a statement about the standing and expertise of the reviewers, as it may be a statement about the quality of the international organization in which this review is being conducted. So that is one of the issues we are struggling with, we are wrestling with, and how to sort of cleanly and neatly separate things from each other there. Okay, another issue that we encounter is how to delineate the group of relevant actors that we want to consider when we assess the authority of a peer reviewing procedure. It is useful here to distinguish between an insider and an outsider perspective. Insiders would be the civil servants that are actually engaged in performing these reviews, who work in international organizations but also in national bureaucracies. There's a clear danger of reaffirming the importance of peer reviews if you just talk to these people who have a stake in the process. We therefore also talk to what we call outsiders, for instance, civil servants who are not involved in the review, but also to parliamentarians, media representatives, and civil society organizations. The real test for the authority of peer reviews comes with the question of whether these procedures are also recognized and taken seriously outside of the inner circle of participants. Now, as I said before, this project is ongoing. And if you're interested, you're very welcome to come again in 1 or 2 years to hear the first real empirical results. So what I have presented now are first results that we get from exploratory interviews. Hortense Jongen has a particular role in this, as well as Valentina Carraro and Martina Kühner, who are currently doing these exploratory interviews. But we would not yet dare now to say the OECD is more authoritative and this is because this and that reason. So more about that in 1 or 2 years. So instead of looking into the crystal ball in that way, let me look into the crystal ball in another way and present some future research plans. I feel that the question of authority and authorization in global affairs provides a fascinating and fruitful research agenda that I want to focus on in the coming years together with my collaborators. One possible way of expanding the focus would of course be to extend it to a range of other institutions or actors in global affairs, both of a public and a private character. There are, in principle, no limitations to the imagination regarding the type of international institution or organization that one could look into here. The limitations are more of a practical nature, having to do first with access for researchers, and second with a potentially very wide range of actors that one would need to talk to in order to know more about the authority of such organizations or about, for instance, a piece of private regulation. So this was the point that should have been shown before. This brings me to my second point. The focus on the authority of global institutions and organizations suggested here inevitably brings with it the question of who actually authorizes. A principal difficulty of the research program suggested here is how to delineate the audience, that is, the group of individuals whose authority perceptions we want to probe into in order to understand more about the authority of an institution or an organization. In the peer review project, we have started with the insiders participating in reviews, and as I've said before, we are now gradually moving to the outsiders. What I find interesting about this discussion is how the authority perceptions of an audience are quite likely changing from the in to the outside, and what that means for the authority of, for instance, an international organization. Third, a linked and equally interesting discussion, at least in my view, I hope you're still with me, is whether institutions can engineer authority perceptions, that is, whether they can engage in some sort of self-authorization. Here, the focus will be on the strategies through which international organizations, but also private regulatory organizations, seek to enhance the legitimacy of their decision-making procedures or their outcomes. We see, for instance, in our project, that some peer-reviewing schemes are willfully designed in such a way as to increase the transparency of the procedure to the outside world. You can see that, for instance, in the Universal Periodic Review, a peer review in the field of human rights conducted at the United Nations level, where the states have decided to put webcasts of each review session on the internet, so it is up there for everyone to see. And poor Valentina is now looking at some of these rather lengthy sessions, and in that sense also gets an intimate insight into how such a review is conducted. Now, the point here is that I find it highly interesting to look into the political and also the rhetorical strategies that international organizations are using in order to make themselves more legitimate in the eye of the beholder, in the eye of an audience. The European Union, for instance, and to a limited extent the United Nations Security Council are, for instance, both engaging in stakeholder dialogues and the involvement of civil society. Beate Kohler has actually done quite a bit of research on participatory democracy in the European Union and how the EU is trying to use that sort of strategy in order to increase its own legitimacy. We should investigate those strategies as well as probe into the ideas of policymakers of how to create legitimacy and authority for their organization. On the other hand, one also needs to look at the process through which such strategies may or may not find resonance. Whether legitimation strategies result in authority perceptions is an open question that can only be clarified empirically. Let me make a fourth and final point. The focus proposed here, in my view, is also relevant for the research programs of our faculty and of the university as a whole. In the research program, Public Bureaucracies of a Globalizing World, that is housed by our faculty, there's a strong focus on trans- and supranational bureaucracies, as we call them. We want to know whether and how these bureaucracies are able to exert influence on the content, scope, and execution of decisions and policies. Bureaucrats usually do not avail of strong material powers vis-à-vis the member states. To the extent that they exert influence, they will do so either because certain powers have been delegated to them or because their expertise or their moral standing is recognized by the political leadership in the member states. The question under what conditions international bureaucracies can have influence on the decisions and policies of international organizations thus can be reformulated as a question about the condition under which international bureaucracies are gaining authority. These conditions can be structural. One could look into policy fields, for instance, that may be more or less ridden by value conflicts or that may be more or less amenable to technical expertise. but one can also look at the actor side. Bureaucracies may actively seek to establish themselves as policy experts, as neutral brokers, or as credibly embodying commonly shared values in a specific area. Their shrewdness, or the lack thereof, in doing this will increase or decrease their authority and thus have an influence on policy decisions and results. These thoughts I'm presenting are of course not peculiar to the research program on public bureaucracies of a globalizing world alone that is housed by the so-called PSA research program in our faculty. Our colleagues from the program on Science, Technology and Society Studies, STS, and on Globalization, Transnationalism and Development are, at least in my view, grappling with similar issues having to do both with the power of experts and expertise and with the question of how societies in the global south and the global north are experiencing and perceiving global change and the role of international organizations. I'm looking forward to explore these avenues of overlap and cross-fertilization together with you, as I look forward to making a contribution to the not United Nations, University of Maastricht, UM, research focal point on Europe and a globalizing world through these activities. Dear all, the research program I have suggested today and that I want to engage in the future is an empirical and a normative one. Doing empirical research on the authority of non-state actors such as international bureaucracies or civil society organizations helps to understand the question of who governs in global affairs. This also is a normative question having to do with the legitimacy of global governance, even though the issue is approached from the perspective of what audiences believe about international institutions and procedures, rather than from the perspective of political philosophy. I believe that the program proposed here should be a complement rather than an alternative to the normative discussion on global governance, which for instance seeks to understand whether international organizations comply with standards of democratic legitimacy or the less demanding standard of public accountability. And actually both Klaus-Dieter Wolff and Helmut Breitmeier have done quite a bit of research on those issues. While this latter perspective is certainly very useful, it does not systematically probe into the legitimacy perceptions of those who are subject to the decision-making power of an organization or an international institution. Any international order, no matter how legitimate it may be from the perspective of political philosophy, ultimately needs to command legitimacy in the eye of the beholder. This then would be the ultimate goal that the research program advanced today would have: to research the ways in which international and global governance can be made more legitimate in the eye of the beholder. That is, in the assessment, not just in the assessment of our community of international relations scholars, but also in the eyes of those who are subject to global governance. I'm coming to the end. Thank you. In preparing my lecture today, I looked at a collection of inaugural lectures given by professors in our faculty's research program on Science, Technology and Society Studies, STS. In one of the lectures given by our colleague Sally Wyatt, who unfortunately cannot be here today, I found this nice description of what an inaugural lecture is and what kind of uneasiness it brings up for the orator. I quote, "An inaugural has a more diverse audience than an ordinary lecture, including colleagues from near and far, in both geographical and disciplinary terms, as well as friends and family. The fear for the orator is that colleagues are thinking, not this again. Doesn't she have anything new to say? Or that is way too programmatic. Ideas about future works are just too easy. Colleagues from different disciplines and friends and family unfamiliar with this weird culture we call academia are quite possibly thinking, what on earth is she talking about? Or who cares? The only person present who might possibly think that every word I utter today is wonderful is my mother." Now, I hope that what Sally Wyatt described here was true only to a limited extent today, except, of course, as regards my mother. And even if you felt lost or bored at times, I still hope that the expectation of an oncoming reception kept you mild-mannered. Let me therefore end by saying a few words of thank you, and in the spirit of internationality, I want to do this in 3 different languages. So now comes the really difficult part. Ik wil mijn dankwoord beginnen met Rijn. De briefkaart die hierboven te zien is, toont natuurlijk niet Rijn, maar een spreuk die hij mij bij mijn afscheid van het faculteitsbestuur meegaf. Vrij vertaald, waar iedereen hetzelfde denkt, wordt niet veel gedacht. Where everyone is thinking the same, not much is being thought. Deze spreuk geeft een goed beeld van hoe ik jou heb ervaren, Rijn. Als iemand die benieuwd is naar de inzichten van anderen, die een open discussie waardeert en die anderen de ruimte geeft om te groeien. Rijn, ik ben uitermate blij dat jij de afgelopen jaren decaan van onze faculteit bent geweest. Ik wil je hartelijk danken voor al je steun vanaf dag 1 in de faculteit. En naast Rijn en het faculteitsbestuur van FASOS wil ik ook het college van bestuur van de Universiteit Maastricht danken voor het in mij gestelde vertrouwen. Opsa. Sophie en Tannely. Sophie? Ja, oké. Toen ik voor de positie van universitair hoofddocent bij de faculteit voor cultuur en maatschappijwetenschappen solliciteerde, zaten jullie naast Rijn in de commissie die over mijn aanstelling besliste. Als kapgroepvoorzitters gaven jullie beiden me vanaf de eerste dag het gevoel bij de FDCMW thuis te zijn. Niet alleen als wetenschapper, maar ook als collega. De mooie Nederlandse woorden ruimdenkendheid en ruimhartigheid zijn de woorden die ik met jullie beiden in verband breng. Hartelijk dank hiervoor. En natuurlijk ook voor de mooie uren en het culinair genieten in de onderste bos, in Mesami en in de vorm van een geriste mispel. Dat is een mispel trouwens. A kind of fruit that Tannely once gave to me as a present in a nice and interesting form. So a culinary experiment that I went through. Now, I have to say that I thank Rijn, Sophie and Tannely as past pro toto of our faculty. When I started working in Maastricht, almost 7 years ago, one of my worries was whether the German past would not cast a shadow, and whether I would not meet a rather glacial welcome here in Maastricht. Luckily, my new colleagues made that worry disappear very soon, and I'm deeply grateful for that. So we can turn away from being German or Dutch or any other nationality and focus on the real things. Let me just thank 3 more of you, again as past pro toto. Esther, is she here? Esther, hi. For convincing me in Uppsala and in Ravenstein, without knowing it actually, that Maastricht would be a good place to work at. Petter, who has been teaching international relations with me for ages and helped me back on stage after 25 years of abstinence on the bass guitar. And Wiebe Nauter, who will only join us tonight, for introducing me to Dutch through Jip and Janneke and being such a warm-hearted and humorous colleague ever since. And as I've mentioned, Uppsala and Ravenstein, I also want to thank Bert-Jan Verbeek, who is not a member of our faculty, but organized 2 wonderful workshops in Uppsala and in Ravenstein, during which I made the first steps towards formalizing my ideas on peer review. So thank you very much also for this. Now, standing here behind this lectern is of course not just the beginning of an intellectual journey. It's also the end point of a long, my parents would say too long, and sometimes winding road. When I was a student, I actually did not start out with the idea of becoming an academic. At times I was about to leave academia altogether and to start a career as a journalist. After graduating in political science in Heidelberg, I was attracted to the University of Mannheim, where Beate Kohler offered a position at her chair. I must say that still today I feel most privileged to have been at Mannheim when so many exciting academic developments took place there. Among them, the establishment of a multi-annual research program on governance in the European Union. One of the unexpected turns of life was that through the influence of Beate Kohler, I began to develop a deep interest in international relations and actually also in the role of the OECD in global governance. This would eventually bring me to the University of Darmstadt to the chair of Klaus-Dieter Wolff. I hope you can agree with the picture that I chose here. And here, yet a completely new world would open, in the form of a research project that focused on the roles of private actors in global affairs, in which also Helmut Breitmeier was involved. Many of the ideas that I presented today began to mature during the time at Mannheim and at Darmstadt. So I'm very glad that both Beate Kohler and Klaus-Dieter Wolff have taken the worry to come here today. Thank you very much for doing that. Liebe Frau Kohler, lieber Klaus, ich habe sowohl in Mannheim als auch in Darmstadt enorm viel gelernt. Ich hätte mir keine besseren Betreuer und Kollegen wünschen können als Sie beide. Vielen herzlichen Dank für alles. Hortense, Valentina and Martina, from left to right. Many of the ideas I have discussed today were developed or tested in long conversations in our project group. And actually I also stole one of the slides from something that Valentina did in one of the presentations last year. I'm tremendously pleased to have you as teammates, and I'm looking forward to the years ahead in which we will hopefully be able to further develop our thoughts on the authority of peer review among states and bring our project to fruition. Many thanks for being such a fantastic group. Thank you. Johanna Höfken and Oksana Slobosan are also in the audience today. I see Johanna, but not Oksana. Okay. Anyway, you were the first 3 PhD candidates, together with Anne-Claire Marangoni, who graduated or are about to graduate under my co-supervision. As much as you may have learned in the course of supervision meetings, I have learned from you, ranging from transparency in the exploitation of oil and gas resources in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, over the ways in which the European Commission dealt with the crisis in Zimbabwe, up to tiny Indian villages which built and struggled over the use of micro hydroelectric plants, something I have never heard about before, honestly. So thank you to all 3 of you for taking me on these geographical and also intellectual journeys. Ganz besonders möchte ich meinen Eltern, meinem Bruder Andreas und seiner Familie danken. Liebe Mama, lieber Papa und Andi mit Familie, seit geraumer Zeit seht ihr euch mit unerschütterlicher Unterstützung meine Laufbahn in der Wissenschaft an. Vielen Dank für eure Freigebigkeit mit so vielen Dingen und für eures offenes Ohr und den Rückhalt, den ich seit so vielen Jahren erfahre. Vielen Dank auch an alle Marbacher und an Eike und Katrin, dass ihr den weiten Weg auf euch genommen habt, heute mit uns feiert. I'm also pleased that so many old friends from my roots in the south of Germany and newfound friends from Aachen can be here today. As past pro toto, let me just mention Steffen, my oldest friend whom I met in the sandbox of our parents' common home in Bad Friedrichshall, close to Heilbronn in southern Germany, who has been with me ever since. Steffen, auch all die anderen Freunde, die heute da sind, vielen Dank, dass ihr gekommen seid, dass ihr heute diesen besonderen Tag mit uns und mit mir feiern wollt. Ich hoffe, es werden noch viele weitere Feiern folgen. Wofür ich euch, liebe Sandra, Amelie und Alexa, zuerst danken kann und soll, weiß ich nicht. Es gäbe so vieles, dass man eigentlich damit noch weitere 45 Minuten füllen könnte. In jedem Fall für eure großen Herzen und dafür, dass ihr mir jeden Tag einen besonderen Blick auf die Fragen von Autorität eröffnet. Sandra, it's now precisely 17 years ago that we first heard these notes together. And they are as true now as they were then. But before I begin to sing, and we are back to the Wickers of Horses, let's stop here. Ik heb gezegd.
Dear Professor Thomas Conselman, dear Thomas, thanks for this inspiring inaugural lecture and also discussing this topical issue with us. Because indeed, if you think about it, it's if you want to have less war and less, a kind of ordered society, then there's only one other thing we can do is learn from each other. And the way we can do that, at least on an institutional level, that is through peer review. That's the way we at least try to learn from others and not just to listen to others. And therefore, indeed, it's crucial to know more about the mechanisms of peer review and how that can be successful and when it also fails. Not just, in the area you have discussed today in global governance, but also, for instance, in university. We also experience that on a day-to-day basis, isn't it? We are peers, and We issue peer reviews, we are objected to peer review, and indeed, if that mechanism does not work very well, also the institution is at stake. And therefore, I think it's really essential that you do research in this kind of issue. At least we listen to you as a peer, and I think we all have learned a lot of you today. Thanks for that. And with this, I close this academic ceremony. And now it's time for drinks, and we have that in the rafter. If you don't know where it is, please follow the red ropes. Thank you.